All right. Thank you so much, Dan. Now that you're all well lubricated, ready for this, for this final uh, moment of the event. We are here today, this evening, to learn about and to show our support of the marvelous Restoring Christian Culture initiative, an initiative with many facets. Sanctus Ranch, this beautiful property and retreat center, Lumen Christi Academy, a school in the great liberal arts tradition, now the only one of its kind in the greater San Antonio area. Unprofitable Servants, a fund to aid canceled priests who adhere to the Mass of the Ages. But in order to understand the importance of this venture, we must ask a very basic question. What is culture? If we cannot answer that question, then we will not understand why restoring it is so important or how to go about doing so. Culture names the shared ways in which a society or people expresses, celebrates, and perpetuates its vision of reality. Let me just repeat that. Culture names the shared ways in which a society or people expresses, celebrates, and perpetuates its vision of reality. A Catholic culture is the culture that a society inspired by the faith will produce and cherish, an environment that turns gently and frequently the mind of man to God, that habituates him to fulfilling his duties here below and aspiring to heavenly glory with the angels and saints, in whose fellowship he already lives by faith, hope, and charity. Culture is primarily about the externals with which we surround ourselves or by which we express what is in our souls. The speech and manners we use, the clothing we wear, the holy days we observe, the fasting we shoulder, the servile arts, the fine arts, the liberal arts we employ to perfect, elevate, and Christianize our lives. Such a culture cannot exist without tradition, which accumulates and passes on the time-honored wisdom and proven practices necessary for rising above the short lifespans and limited abilities of individual men. Such a culture cannot exist without being rooted in and centered on the offering of divine worship to Almighty God, the transcendent source and aim of whatever goodness or truth or beauty exists in anything and everything we are or have or use or make. Such a culture cannot exist without a cultic priesthood, because the cultus, the adoration of the deity, is the nurturing origin of all culture. So much so that no culture has ever arisen except from religion and sacrifice. And no culture has ever survived the loss of religion and sacrifice, as we are seeing all around us in the modern West. Let me offer a simple case study to show what I mean about the centrality of liturgical sacrifice. The Middle Ages have left behind a Europe studded with sublime cathedrals that rise to the heavens and take our breaths away. What is a Gothic cathedral but a giant sacrificial offering to the God of light, the God of infinite majesty and glory? Yet the cathedral, for all its impressiveness, was built in the first place for one reason only: to house the holy sacrifice of the Mass, in which the God-man offers himself and the entire cosmos to the Heavenly Father. It is a house of glory for the ultimate sacrifice to God's glory. John Sr. writes, quote, "Whatever we do in the political or social order, the indispensable foundation is prayer, the heart of which is the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the perfect prayer of Christ himself, priest and victim, recreating in an unbloody manner the bloody, self-same sacrifice of Calvary." What is Christian culture? It is essentially the Mass. That is not my or anyone's opinion or theory or wish, but the central fact of 2,000 years of history. Christendom, what secularists call Western civilization, is the Mass and the paraphernalia which protect and facilitate it. All architecture, art, political and social forms, economics, the way people live and feel and think, music, literature, all these things, when they are right, are ways of fostering and protecting the holy sacrifice of the Mass. To enact a sacrifice, there must be an altar. An altar has to have a roof over it in case it rains. To reserve the Blessed Sacrament, we build a little house of gold, and over it a tower of ivory with a bell and a garden round it, with roses and lilies of purity, emblems of the Virgin Mary, who carried his body and his blood in her womb, body of her body, blood of her blood. And around the church and garden where we bury the faithful dead, the caretakers live, the priests and religious whose work is prayer, who keep the mystery of faith in its tabernacle of music and words in the office of the church. And around them, the faithful who gather to worship and divide the other work that must be done in order to make the perpetuation of the sacrifice possible, to raise the food and make the clothes and build and keep the peace, so that generations to come may live for him, so that the sacrifice goes on even until the consummation of the world. Unquote. That's all John Sr. If Sr. is right, and I believe he is not exaggerating one bit, the sum total of Western Christian civilization and the richness of its cultural expressions can be understood as in some way leading to and from the Holy Mass. In the hierarchy of values that animated the Catholic soul, nothing stood higher in this world below. The sacramental mysteries of the Church were her highest participation in the central act of the heavenly Jerusalem, the place where heaven descended to earth and earth touched the fringe of heaven. Note how diverse and colorful is Senior's description of all that is needed for the Mass to be worthily housed and offered, in order to be free to be itself. It should come as no surprise that something so integral to man's nature as divine worship will be tradition-bound. A former colleague of mine at Wyoming Catholic College, by the name of Patrick Owens, explains this point well in words that have a strong bearing on Lumen Christi Academy. Quote, "It is education that conserves and transmits the experience and wisdom of the previous generations, so that such a cultural memory, identity, and common parlance can be forged and strengthened. Indeed, for most of human history, this inculturation has been a primary purpose of education. Language encapsulates the culture and the history of a society. Those elements are passed to the successive generations through the language, so that future generations may benefit from the sufferings and discoveries of their forebears and enjoy the comfort of participation in a transcendent community that reaches back through the ages. Rightly conceived, culture is the conscious ideal of human perfection and the habitual vision of greatness. In the case of Catholic culture, this community originates with the apostles and our Lord himself. The language that provides the divine office with its poetic freedom and simultaneously constrains the prose to prescriptive ancient norms, carries in its rich history an immense treasure of thought and feeling from both pre-Christian and apostolic times. For the better part of 2,000 years, it has provided the Church with a language of worship, an intellectual clarity, and a mark of Catholicity." Unquote. This passage is defending Latin in particular, but I think it's true of all of Catholic culture, what Patrick Owens said. Needless to say, the Church on earth today does not, by and large, seem to share any of this worldview or hierarchy of values. Leading into, during, and after the Second Vatican Council, a new wave of rationalism swept through the Church, a belief that the most important way to transmit the faith was to talk about it and to make people talk back. Proponents of this view thought the faithful would become more serious and mature Christians if only what they, the proponents, regarded as the distracting clutter of the visual and musical heritage of the church could be cleared away. Instead of breathtaking architecture and elaborate sanctuaries, sublime polyphony, and otherworldly chant, the 1960s reformers advocated clean, empty spaces and songs written in a popular style that had nothing transcendent about it. The reformatory rationalism quickly turned into the third wave of iconoclasm in church history, as sanctuaries, high altars, statues, reliquaries, pulpits, choir lofts, pipe organs, and many other donations of the devout were smashed into bits and cast into dumpsters. Modernity is, as such, revolutionary, and its revolution is directed against not just Christianity in general, but against incarnational, sacramental, liturgical, sacrificial Catholicism in particular. Modernity was born in rebellion against the divine order embodied in Christendom, against its transcendentals of fixed and knowable truth, fertile and lovable goodness, attractive and consoling beauty. That is why modern culture, to the extent that it is self-consciously modern, is hideously ugly, barren, hateful, mendacious, nauseating, and depressing. It is, in fact, an anti-culture because it is directed against the cultus of the God-man, the one and only Redeemer of mankind. This revolutionary spirit that I'm speaking of can be seen most perfectly in two moments, in the Protestant Revolt and in the French Revolution. Tragically, the modern spirit invaded the Catholic Church when the windows were opened at Vatican II and the smoke of Satan rose from the fissures in the temple, as Paul VI himself admitted, although he did not seem clued in to the fact that it was he, to a large extent, who had brought in the jackhammers that created those fissures to the underworld. This he did primarily through a liturgical reform, quote unquote, that was, in truth, a revolution, utterly contemptuous of tradition, culture, beauty, mystery, and even the most basic laws of human psychology. The battle being waged for the soul of the Church and the soul of the West right now in our midst is a battle that necessarily rages around the holy sacrifice of the Mass and the other rituals of grace. It necessarily rages around the ministerial priesthood, empowered to offer this sacrifice. It necessarily rages around the education of our children, who, by their baptism, have a right to sound Catholic education, which we have a duty to provide for them. Let no one be deceived for a moment. Satan goes after traditional priests and innocent children more than after any other categories of mankind. He goes after the priests who can do the most damage to his anti-kingdom. He goes after the children to cut the ties that bind them to Jesus Christ, to the Church, to the Mass, to the Catholic tradition and culture that defines us and gives us the weapons we need to fight him and the medicines we need for healing when we are wounded in the fray. Sanctus Ranch boasts a chapel where the traditional Mass is and can be safely offered, a classical school imbued with the Catholic faith for the sake of our beloved children, and a command post for the effort to assist persecuted traditional priests. Any one of these is a crucial way to restore a shattered Christian culture. Having all three of them together in one place is unique in the whole world. Thanks be to God for inspiring these efforts. We are living in the so-called age of the laity. Most of our pastors, especially the bishops, have given up, allowing the optimistic but aggressively secular spirit of modernity, which we could call modernism, to take over. It has fallen to the baptized sons of God and confirmed soldiers of Christ to persevere in the faith once delivered to the saints and to hand it on, with the aid of a few good bishops and a few good priests. Let's not forget that the same thing occurred during the great Arian crisis of the 4th century, when it was Athanasius contra mundum, Saint Athanasius against the world. St. John Henry Newman says outright that during this crisis, it was the lay faithful who kept the faith better than their shepherds, and that if it had not been for the laity, the few Orthodox bishops would not have succeeded. Newman got in trouble for saying that, by the way, but he never, ever would disclaim what he said, because he was a historian. He knew that what he said was true. We are living in very difficult times, as you all know. Our bishops have largely abandoned us to the wolves as they preside over the slow shutdown of parishes in their dioceses, banish devout Latin Mass congregations to basements, gyms, and attics before erasing them off the map, pay out for sex abuse damages millions of hard-earned dollars of donations, throw obstacles in the way of any genuine efforts for renewal. Years of hard work seem to be thrown into the rubbish. In this connection, a phrase I've often recalled comes to mind, the Benedictine motto, succisa virescit. By the way, the Benedictines have 100 different mottos, like ora et labora and pax and various other things, but this is one of them, succisa virescit. This means cut down, it flourishes again. I first met this lapidary Latin phrase, probably referring to the art of pruning, in an all-boys high school run by Benedictine monks. At the time, I didn't make much of it, but it lodged itself in my memory all the same. Later, after several years of friendship with Father Cassian Folsom and the monks of Norcia in Italy, I took on their liturgical and biblical spirituality by becoming an oblate of that monastery. When the great earthquake of 2016 destroyed the town of Norcia, including the monastery, and the monks began to build a new monastery nearly from scratch, the powerful truth of these words, succisa virescit, hit me in the gut, as I'm sure it hit them much more. Since then, they have built a beautiful monastery up in the mountains, even better for their monastic life than the one that was destroyed. The traditional Roman Rite, too, offers a perfect illustration of the truth of this motto, succisa virescit. In spite of being cut down, the great liturgy of Rome has never ceased to grow back, and today it does flourish again, here and there, in spite of renewed attempts to abolish it, all of them illicit and doomed to fail. The past 12 years, and in particular the past 4 years since Traditionis Custodes, have been very hard on a lot of people. We have seen many flourishing Latin Mass communities planted in faith and zeal, torn down by hirelings unworthy to lick the dust beneath the apostles' feet. Cardinal Blaise Supich of Chicago, Archbishop Gustavo Garcia Siller of San Antonio, Bishop Edward Weisenberger of Detroit, Bishop Michael Martin of Charlotte, and others besides are destroyers, not builders, ravening wolves, not caring shepherds. When Archbishop Vigano blew the whistle in the Summer of Shame, that was 2018, he became an international hero overnight to Catholics everywhere, especially those who had been battling the corruption of the hierarchy more or less unsuccessfully for decades. While it is true that plenty of corruption remains, in fact, the corruption greatly increased under Pope Francis, as John Lamont and Henry Cyr, among others, have documented. Nevertheless, 2018 marked a turning point in public awareness and the mentality of the laity, which began to take a more militant direction. Regardless of where Vigano has drifted since then, the exposure of the McCarrick network prompted a tectonic shift. There is now a much healthier skepticism about officialdom and a spirit of determined resistance on the part of Catholics who take their faith most seriously. The corruption is plain to see, and the remedies for it are also clear. The traditional Catholic faith, traditional prayer and penance, and an uncompromising commitment to the full restoration of the faith. We might call this a counter-revolutionary credo. As traditional Latin Masses continue to get cancelled, it is well to remind ourselves, succisa virescit, cut down, it grows back again. What is taken away can return. With faith and zeal, it will return. But why do I think this will happen when so many wielders of power are ranged against it? Well, this is how it was in the 1970s. Nearly every traditional Latin Mass disappeared. Only a few die-hard priests held on, usually at the expense of their official recognition. They were essentially driven into the catacombs. They were the first canceled priests. But they did not give up. In the very state in which I grew up, New Jersey, by the way, I have to just lay claim here. I was born in Chicago. I don't know if Father Level is here. I was born in Chicago, but I grew up in New Jersey. So, well, we could talk about that later. So in the very state where I grew up, there were 3 chapels started by canceled traditional priests. I mean, there might have been more, but I knew about these 3. All of which, years later, were reconciled with their dioceses when feelings had calmed down and more reasonable bishops were in office. In one of these 3 chapels, my wife, an adult convert, received her first communion. In another, we were married. And in a third, a priest said a requiem for my mother. So all 3 of these chapels have deep personal meaning to us. These chapels literally would not exist today, offering exclusively the traditional sacraments, if their founding clergy had not been courageous and clear-minded enough to resist what they saw as a catastrophic liturgical revolution. They were right back then. Clergy who follow in their footsteps today are no less right. The chapel here at Sanctus Ranch joyfully claims continuity with this heritage of loyalty to the faith and the Mass of the ages. I have been criticized for urging priests to resist their bishops over the cancellation of the traditional Mass. But I urge this with full awareness of what I am saying and why. In situations where bishops frontally attack the God-given rights of the faithful and the God-given duty of priests to serve the common good of the Church, both laity and clergy should disobey the Latin Mass restrictions and ignore all subsequent penalties. If every priest in the 1970s had simply gone along with the supposed complete ban on the old rite, which, by the way, a 1986 Commission of Cardinals and the 2007 motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum, showed was groundless, there would be no traditional Mass anywhere in the world today. And much else that belongs to the faith would have perished along with it. This is undeniable. By believing that a bishop like Michael Martin or even a pope like Francis has the authority to cut off the Church's liturgical tradition and to stymie the legitimate aspirations of the faithful who are nourished by it, and then by acting according to this belief, one plays directly into the hands of the modernist revolution. Slowly, TLMs increased from the 1970s onwards. First came the Agatha Christi indult of 1971, then Quator Apunk Annos in 1984, the Commission of Cardinals in 1986, Ecclesia Dei in 1988, and at long last, Summorum Pontificum in 2007, confirming what the traditionalists had known all along. The old rite had never been suppressed or canonically forbidden, and all priests are free to use it, needing no permission. This remains true, regardless of what ignorant potentates may believe. Since the motto of the current regime seems to be back to the 70s, we're being mowed down again, at least here and there. Yet this time we are not so ignorant and helpless. We know that Benedict XVI was right and Francis was wrong. In spite of the extermination campaign, traditional Catholics are now spread over the face of the earth. Did you know that the traditional Latin Mass is offered today in over 100 countries? It's a neat statistic to bear in mind. And we have both truth and youth on our side. if we persevere in our love for tradition, we can be certain it will return and flourish more than ever. The anti-TLM forces are mostly elderly and on their way out. The pro-TLM forces are youthful and on the rise. My advice to everyone: hold fast, hold steady, hold out. There will come a day when one will be able to say, in the words of the angel to Saint Joseph, "Arise and go, for they are dead that sought the life of the child." Someday, later than we might think, but sooner than we may think possible, later than we might wish, but sooner than we may think possible, it will be no less true to say, "They are dead who sought to suppress tradition." Let us recall how little it can take to change the world or to change the church. All masses began with just one. On Maundy Thursday, in an upper room of frightened disciples, offered by the hands of a man marked for death. The fervor of the medieval monastery of Cluny gave rise in time to a mighty spiritual empire of some 1,200 or 1,400 monasteries under its authority or influence. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux helped establish 163 monasteries in Europe. Saint Teresa of Avila founded 17 convents. Examples like this from church history can be multiplied. God always chooses one for the sake of many, a minority for the sake of the majority. He does so to show that it is His power at work in our weakness, His grace that wins for us a kingdom. The weak confound the strong, the small confound the great, over and over again. Our enemy is not the Pope, synodality, the new Mass, or Vatican II. Our enemy par excellence is the enemy of human nature, Satan, who deftly wields the weapon of discouragement, which leads people to give up, to say, "What's the point? We'll always lose." This is not only not a Christian attitude, it is an anti-Christian attitude. It delivers us into the hands of our enemies. Instead of giving them the victory they want, we will oppose them day after day, year after year, with zealous fidelity. Or better, we will cleave to Christ and to the blessings He imparted upon the Church in better ages, as we pray and work for a better age to come by His grace. We are in this together. It is a privilege to be part of a minority that loves what the Church Universal has always loved, what the saints loved and lived, what sanctified our ancestors and still inspires and feeds us today. It is, above all, a privilege to be summoned into the Lord's service at precisely this moment of history, for it means God in His eternal providence has chosen us, you and me, to bear the Church's inheritance through the desert, as Israel carried the Ark of the Covenant. He did not place us on earth at a different time, when tradition was taken for granted as an indisputable good. We may lament that our age has lost its mind, or we may do something to heal its disease. As we saw in a recent, as we have seen, all that happens by God's wise and holy will, not by irrational chance. Thus, He is asking you and me at this time to be His Marian magnifiers, His Johannine bosom friends, His Petrine rocks, His Pauline evangelists, on behalf of all that is good, right, holy, true, just, and beautiful. We did not choose this privilege, or else it would be a matter for boasting. He chose us in the inscrutable counsels of eternity to be shafts of light piercing into the present darkness. All glory be to Him, the Father of lights, with whom there is no change nor shadow of alteration. Let us boldly proceed with confidence in God and earnest prayer. He will rebuild the walls of Zion and renew the fortunes of His people. This is no easy comfort. Our good deeds will not go unpunished here. and many great endeavors will either collapse or never come to fruition. Yet, like every creative minority mentioned earlier, we never stop walking, indeed running, toward that heavenly kingdom, striving to discover, participate in, and strengthen here below the sure signs and true tokens of its lofty, immaculate, imperishable beauty. Done for love of God, that is certainly a cause worth living and dying for, one that fulfills and rewards even those who are bowed down and laid low. I urge all my fellow traditionalists to take up whatever precious vessels of tradition you have available to you and make of them the most you can for yourself, in your family, among your friends, in your parish or community. This might be praying the breviary or the rosary at home, singing chant, going on retreat from time to time at a Benedictine monastery, spreading good literature, making strategic donations, or whatever it is that the Lord has put at your disposal. These are the potent seeds of the present from which He will summon forth the fruitful trees of the future. These are indeed the already existing roots from which the ineradicable tree of life will continue to grow, no matter how many times it is cut down. Succisa, virescit. I think it will be helpful if I explain the distinction between the conservative wing of the Church and the traditional movement. For conservatives, tradition is purely conventional, worth hanging on to whenever possible, but not intrinsically worthwhile. Conservatism is what's left over when one has lost the battle for one's culture. One holds on to favored externals, to sentimental moments, because the force of life has vanished. That is why Catholic conservatism is often content to retain certain outward signs of tradition, for example, incense, Gregorian chant, ad orientem, without fully embracing their inward realities. The traditionalist movement sees things quite differently. What matters most for us is the integrity of the Mass, that this liturgy be in vital continuity with the past in every step of its growth. The smells and bells enhance the experience and are, of course, part of the tradition. They are certainly fitting for the occasion, but they cannot substitute for the lack of traditional content in text, music, and rubrics. As Martin Mosebach says, an old Latin Mass offered quietly in a garage has more spiritual density and authenticity than a Novus Ordo Mass done up in a huge cathedral with a polyphonic choir. If you think I say controversial things, just read Martin Mosebach. He's really hot stuff. To understand better what is wrong with conservatism, we need to be aware of the extent to which it already buys into modernity's basic presuppositions. To the extent that the term modernity refers not merely to a chronological period, but to a worldview or set of beliefs or a range of commitments at their extreme form ideologies. We must say without mincing words that modernity is predicated on the rejection of tradition. Not just various traditions, but tradition as such. That is, the humble and grateful reliance on the cultural patrimony received from our forefathers. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, famously makes the repudiation of tradition and the trust in his own reason alone the basis of his entire philosophy. And every modern thinker after him has done the same to one degree or another. The only exceptions in the world of thought are those who, like the Thomists, expressly ally themselves with a pre-modern tradition and who thereby gain the reputation of being anti-modern. The 19th century social reformer Alexander Herzen distinguishes between two types of reformers: those who stand in judgment over the past, but have weak knees and end up sentimentally rescuing or tolerating some of it, and those who, with a Nietzschean will to power, find satisfaction in thoroughly smashing up the past and cleansing the present of it. This would be what we call woke people today. His description of the former type, the weak-kneed, ones, may remind us of such figures as John Paul II and Benedict XVI, while his description of the latter, the Nietzschean will to power types, will remind us eerily of the mentality and actions of Pope Francis. So this is just the quotation from Herzen, quote, "People are afraid of their modern logic, and having rashly summoned to court the church, the state, the family, and morality, good and evil, they endeavor to save some scraps, fragments of the old. But there are those who, more in keeping with that logic, discard the last ballast of the past and march boldly forward. In passing from the old world to the new, one can take nothing along. We are to be executioners of the past. To us is left the task of persecuting and identifying the past, no matter what disguise it assumes, and of executing it and laying it on the altar of the future." Unquote. That's a perfect description of the revolutionary mentality. Conservatism is nothing other than a slow-motion version of the same liberalism that rejects tradition. For conservatives wish to keep this or that particular tradition while generally accepting the modern stance against the great tradition in its totality. Put differently, a conservative is one who wants to keep pretty pieces of the whole, but not the whole itself, and who puts the pieces ahead of the whole. For example, and I mentioned this before, but I think it's worth pointing out, when I'm speaking of conservatism here, I mean particularly Catholic conservatism. I'm not really talking about like Republican political conservatism. That's a different discussion. This is about in the Catholic Church, right? A conservative Catholic may say he loves ad orientem and incense and chant, but he does not want the traditional liturgy that gave rise to and perfectly suits that orientation and that chant. He may not care what the priest is saying when he's facing ad orientem, whether it's the Roman canon or Eucharistic prayer number 2, that is the pseudo-Roman, pseudo-Eucharistic prayer of pseudo-Hippolytus. That would be a little complicated to explain, but anyway. As far as he's concerned, the sweet smell of incense is more important than a lex orandi, a law of prayer that reaches us unbroken from the earliest centuries of the Church. In this way, the Catholic conservative is entirely modern in his picking and choosing, as from a superior platform, what elements of tradition are to be retained and which ones abandoned. The results are usually arbitrary and incoherent. We must recognize that we who appreciate, who love tradition, and here we're talking not only about the Church's liturgical tradition, but about everything she has received from the hand of divine providence, and indeed the sum total of all cultural goods that precede the present moment. We are fighting a battle of unprecedented, even unimaginable proportions. Everyone is against us. The modern secularist governments that try to erase their own national history and identity, modern school systems that indoctrinate and poison susceptible children, modern industries that rely on people being mindless consumers with no moral bearings, modern media that drown their addicts in a continual flux of largely useless and heavily manipulated information, and shockingly, a large number of the Church's hierarchy who explicitly repudiate tradition, seeing every earlier phase of Catholicism as a stepping stone or prelude to the latest and greatest development. Basically, everyone in the modern world has become habituated to think of change and progress as the only goods, and to think of tradition as superseded, either practically irrelevant or actually dangerous. Because it prevents progress, they say. Because this entire view is so deeply false and harmful to the Catholic faith and to human life itself, we must be serious about rejecting it and living as best we can according to the truth and according to the great tradition. If that means living temporarily at odds with or in opposition to the Church's hierarchy here or there, so be it. No one ever promised that the hierarchy would be totally immune to cultural contamination or ideological infiltration. And when we see that such has occurred, we must keep our distance. I like to say, I'll keep a respectful distance. The spiritual and cultural inheritance of Catholicism is not just window dressing or the icing on the cake. It is the primary carrier or vehicle of a social religion. The Catholic Church lives, moves, and has its being from apostolic tradition and the multitude of ecclesiastical traditions that sprang forth from it, in the way artistic accomplishments rise from generations of trained artisans. Adhering to this patrimony is not easy in a revolutionary age, but the alternative is absorption into the world, cultural apostasy, spiritual amnesia, a frightening loss of identity, meaning, values, and direction. The rebuilding of the bridge between past, present, and future is already happening all over the world. It will take a few generations to make the bridge strong. Meanwhile, modernist or progressive Catholicism is greedily consuming itself with religious indifferentism, moral laxity, vapid catechesis, clerical scandals, barren or barely fruitful marriages, and self-sabotaging models of religious life. It does not have the wherewithal to endure modern progressive Catholicism. If what I have argued is true, the modernized form of Catholicism is self-contradictory, like a battery running down with no possibility of recharging. At this particular moment, when the new iconoclasts are so intoxicated with ideology that they do not hesitate to contradict even their cherished Second Vatican Council whenever it stands in the way of their objectives, it may often seem to us that we will never reach this goal of a restoration of the traditional liturgy and the way of life it sustains. It is nonetheless consoling to point out that bodily writhing is strongest right before death. At least that's consoling to me in this case. And that the air is coldest at dawn. In other words, the modern iconoclasts are at their worst right now, but they are quickly running out of time. This is the final lashing out. Love is a positive, fruitful force, while hatred is a negative and self-sabotaging one. Love abides and expands, while hatred consumes itself. This is why I am confident that the iconophiles, the lovers of sacred images, the lovers of divine beauty, will prevail over the iconoclasts, the purveyors of plainness, emptiness, and ugliness. Catholics have a sacred right, owing to their baptism into the glorified Jesus Christ, to the full expression of their faith within the liturgy and through all the arts that embellish and support it. They have a right to free access to the glories of tradition, which have been cherished and handed down for centuries and must be cherished and handed down until the end of time. Corresponding to this right is, as always, a duty. Catholics have a duty to preserve, cherish, and perpetuate this tradition. They have a responsibility to come to know it and love it more and more over their lifetimes. We are not to sit back and wait until someone brings us beauty and tradition on a platter. We are to work on beautifying and traditionalizing our interior life through prayer, our external life through manners, ongoing education, and cultural pursuits. We are to support the clergy with our prayers and whatever resources the Lord has blessed us with, so that the riches of tradition may flourish again. It is not someone else who must fix these problems. It is we ourselves, whom the Lord calls to take up a shovel in one arm and a sword in the other. What God gives us as our inheritance is not just the here and now, but the faith and love of generations who have come before us, embodied in countless treasures of music, painting, sculpture, architecture, and writing, destined for the edification of souls until the end of time. All this has been given to us in proportion to our capacities, positions, and opportunities for action. We are the path by which tradition will reach or not reach our descendants. Much today depends on lay involvement, as Vatican II rightly predicted. Lay people who are humbly, cheerfully, and generously devoted to the protection and promotion of Christian culture, centered on the Mass and surrounded on all sides with the beauty that befits it, have been and will continue to be a major factor in the longed-for renewal of the Church. We all have our favorite saints. After Our Lady, of course, my favorite is Saint Therese of the Child Jesus and of the Holy Face. As laity in a position to positively influence society and the Church, I think we should pay special attention to the ranks of saintly kings and queens, lords and ladies who graced the ancient Roman Rite. They were the social influencers of their day. These men and women did everything in their power to promote the common good of the societies in which they had been placed. They expended their time, energy, and wealth on education, the fine arts, and the poor. And as Mother Teresa said, the worst poverty of today is spiritual, not material. They endowed monasteries, shrines, and chapels, much like the one here at Sanctus Ranch. They lived by the rhythm of the liturgical calendar and practiced personal asceticism. We are free to imitate them today as we strive to bring something of the best into a fallen world where the worst all too often holds sway. It may seem that everyone is against us, but truth is on our side. Tradition, the democracy of the dead, is on our side. And that means ultimately God is on our side. There is no reason for despair. There is reason for courage and clear commitment. A still, small voice is calling us back to the potent treasury of the ages. The demons know that the worst thing that can happen to a modern person from their point of view is to be rescued from his contemporary prison and reunited with the 2,000-year breadth and depth of Catholicism. It is understandable that the devil will do all he can do to thwart this conversion of mind and heart. For in each and every soul that undergoes it, tradition lives again in our midst and brings new life to a world out of date. Thank you for your patience and kind attention.